So, this is a story someone I used to know told me. Anne, we worked together for a couple of years, and she was one of the most level-headed people I've ever met. The kind of person who double-checks her receipts and always has an umbrella when it looks like it might rain. That's why, when she told me all this, it stuck with me. Because if something like this could happen to her, it feels like it could happen to anyone. She told me it all started when she finally got her own place. For years, she'd been bouncing between roommate situations, you know how it is. Loud music at 2 a.m., dishes piled in the sink for a week, someone's weird boyfriend always on the couch. She'd saved up for what felt like an eternity, and a top-floor apartment opened up in this old brick building in a decent, if a little boring, part of town. The building itself was nothing special. The lobby smelled faintly of old carpet and pine sol, and the elevator groaned like an old man getting out of a chair. But the apartment itself, number 6B, was perfect. It had good bones, she said. High ceilings, big windows that let in a ton of natural light, and hardwood floors that creaked in a comforting, homey way. Most importantly, it was all hers. The silence was the first thing she fell in love with. The sheer, blissful quiet of being on the top floor, with no one stomping around above her. For the first time in her adult life, she could come home, lock the door, and the entire world would just stop. The space was her own private bubble. She spent that first weekend in a blissful state of chaos, surrounded by cardboard boxes. She said she tackled the bedroom first. That was going to be her sanctuary. Not just a place to sleep, but the place where she could completely decompress, where nothing and nobody could get to her. She painted the walls a soft, calming gray. She assembled a new bed frame by herself, struggling with the Allen key and the confusing diagrams, but feeling this immense pride when the last screw was tightened. The mattress was new, the sheets were high thread count cotton she'd splurged on. It was her nest, her fortress. The first few days were exactly what she dreamed of. She'd come home from her 9-to-5 admin job, kick off her shoes, and just breathe. She'd make a simple dinner, eat it while watching some show she didn't have to compromise on, and then retreat to her bedroom. She'd lie there in her new bed, propped up on plush pillows, reading a book or just scrolling on her phone, and a wave of pure contentment would wash over her. This was it. This was the peace she had been working for. The building was old, sure, but it felt solid, secure. She was on the 6th floor, far above the street noise. The only sounds were the distant, muted wail of a siren or the gentle hum of her own refrigerator. It was on the 4th or 5th night that she first noticed it. She'd finished her book and had just turned off her bedside lamp, ready to drift off to sleep. The room was dark, but not completely black. A little bit of orange city glow filtered through the blinds, painting soft stripes on the ceiling. Her eyes were just wandering lazily, a habit from childhood, tracing patterns in the faint light. And that's when she saw it. On the smooth, white expanse of the plaster ceiling, right over the foot of her bed, there was a tiny, dark line. It was incredibly fine, thin as a strand of hair that someone had drawn with a precise, mechanical pencil. A crack. Her first thought was nothing. Literally nothing. It was just a fact. There's a crack in the ceiling. Her next thought was a logical shrug. Old building. Things settle. Plaster cracks. It's normal. It was probably there when she moved in and she just hadn't noticed it in the daylight. It was so insignificant, so minor, that worrying about it felt ridiculous. It was a tiny imperfection in her otherwise perfect sanctuary, and she could live with that. She rolled over and fell asleep without another thought. For the next week or so, her life continued in its peaceful rhythm. The crack was just part of the room's geography now. Sometimes, in the morning, her eyes would land on it as she woke up. In the evening, she'd see it in the lamplight. It didn't bother her. It was just there, a tiny, silent flaw. It was easy to ignore. Anne was good at compartmentalizing. The crack was a landlord problem, something she'd get around to mentioning in an email one of these days, but it wasn't an Anne problem. Her problem was getting to work on time and figuring out what to have for lunch. But you know how it is when you notice something small. You can't unnotice it. It becomes a focal point. Every time she was in her room, her gaze would eventually, inevitably, drift upwards to that thin, dark line. She started to develop a strange, one-sided relationship with it. And a quiet, nagging little thought started to whisper in the back of her mind. A thought she tried very hard to push away. It felt like it was getting longer. It was an absurd idea. A crack doesn't just grow overnight. It was a trick of the light, or her memory playing games. Maybe one day the shadows made it look a certain way, and the next day the bright morning sun made it look different. She'd measure it, she decided one morning, just to prove to herself how silly she was being. But then she'd get busy, the day would take over, and by the time she got home, the idea of standing on her brand new bed with a tape measure seemed like too much effort for something so trivial. It was easier to just tell herself she was imagining it. But the feeling persisted. It was like watching a plant grow. You can't see the movement in real time, but you know, day by day, it's changing. The line seemed to be stretching, elongating itself by maybe a millimeter at a time, creeping silently across the white ceiling. It was like a slow, deliberate scar being carved into the skin of her safe space. The feeling it gave her wasn't fear, not yet. It was an annoyance. A low-grade, persistent irritation, like a single mosquito buzzing just out of reach in a dark room. It was a flaw in the system, a bug in the code of her perfect, quiet life. One night, she lay in bed, staring at it. The light from the street was a little brighter than usual. The crack was no longer just a hairline. It had a little more substance now. It looked less like a pencil line and more like something drawn with a fine-tipped pen. Still tiny, still, by any reasonable standard, completely harmless. But it was undeniably more prominent than it had been a week ago. She sat up, a real flicker of unease finally cutting through her rationalizations. Okay, this is weird. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold on the wood floor, and flicked on the main overhead light. The sudden, harsh brightness flooded the room, washing out all the shadows. And there it was, exposed in the stark light. A crack, just a crack, a thin, spidery line about 6 inches long. Seeing a picture of it, you'd think nothing of it. But Anne had been watching it. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the floorboards, that last week it had only been 3 inches long. She stood there, in the middle of her sanctuary, craning her neck to stare at the ceiling. The silence of the apartment, once so comforting, suddenly felt heavy. Oppressive. It wasn't the silence of peace anymore, it was the silence of something holding its breath. She was alone on the top floor of an old building, staring at a crack that was actively, demonstrably growing. She tried to reason with herself again. The building is shifting, temperature changes, humidity. There were a dozen logical, boring explanations. But logic wasn't helping anymore. An instinct, something primal and old, was telling her that something was wrong. An intrusion, no matter how small, into a sealed space is still an intrusion. That night, before turning off the light, she looked at it one last time. It seemed to mock her from its position on the ceiling, a tiny, jagged smile in the white plaster. She thought, for a fleeting, ridiculous moment, that it almost looked like it was pointing towards her, towards the spot on the bed where she slept. "Don't be an idiot, Anne," she whispered to the empty room. She got into bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and forced her eyes shut. She told herself that tomorrow, first thing, she would email the building manager. No more procrastinating. She would demand they come and fix it. She'd insist. But as she lay there in the dark, every tiny creak of the old building sounded different. Every groan of the pipes, every distant rumble of the city, seemed to be connected to that line above her. She felt exposed, as if she were sleeping outside under a cracked sky. The feeling of safety she had cherished, the very foundation of her new life, had a hairline fracture running right through the middle of it. And in that moment she had the distinct and terrifying feeling that she wasn't just imagining it. It was getting longer, and she was sleeping right underneath it. That next morning, Anne did exactly what she said she was going to do. Level-headed Anne, remember? Problems have solutions. You don't just stare at them. You act. Before she even brewed her coffee, she sat down at her little kitchen table, opened her laptop, and composed a very polite, very firm email to the building management. She was professional about it. She mentioned that she was a new tenant in 6B, that she was very happy with the apartment, but that she had noticed a minor structural issue in the bedroom ceiling. She used phrases like progressive hairline fracture, and asked if they could send someone from maintenance to take a look at their earliest convenience. She even attached a picture she'd taken with her phone in the stark morning light. It looked embarrassingly minor in the photo, just a faint gray pencil line on a white background. But she hit send anyway, and a small part of the tension in her shoulders released. There, it was someone else's problem now. The day went on as usual. Work was work. She came home, the building lobby still smelled of pine sol and old memories, the elevator still groaned. She made herself a salad for dinner, put on some show that she only half watched, and felt a sense of normalcy returning. The fear from the night before felt distant, almost silly. It was just a crack. Maintenance would come, they'd spackle it, maybe paint over it, and her sanctuary would be whole again. The system worked. She went to bed that night feeling almost defiant. She was taking back her space. But as she lay there, the silence felt different again. Before, it had been the silence of something holding its breath. Now, it was the silence of something listening. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying not to look at the crack but unable to look away. And that's when she heard the first new sound. It was faint, so faint, in fact, that for a moment she thought she'd imagined it. It was a soft, dry, scuttling sound, like a mouse dragging a piece of paper across a wooden floor. It came from directly above her, from somewhere in the ceiling. Her first, immediate thought was mice. Of course, it's an old building, she's on the top floor, right under the roof space. It was the most logical, most obvious explanation in the world. Anne told me she actually felt a wave of relief wash over her. Mice she could handle. Mice were a known quantity. Annoying, a little gross, but not threatening. Not in the same way that a silently growing crack felt threatening. It gave a name to the wrongness. The scuttling sound went on for maybe a minute, a little pitter-patter of tiny feet, and then it stopped. She lay there, listening, and eventually, convinced it was over, she rolled onto her side and fell asleep. For the next few nights, it became part of her routine. She'd lie down, and sometime in the deep quiet after midnight, the scratching and scuttling would start. It was never very loud, just a persistent, intermittent little noise from above. She'd lie there and picture a small field mouse, busying itself with whatever mice do in the dark, forgotten spaces of old buildings. She named him Stuart, in her head. It was a way to make it less creepy, to domesticate the intrusion. She doubled down on her email to management, adding a postscript about potential pests in the ceiling void. They replied with a generic, "We have received your request and will address it in the order it was received." Anne figured that meant she'd be living with Stuart for a while. But then, about a week after the first scuttling sound, things changed. The sounds became bolder. It wasn't just a faint scratching anymore. There was a dragging sound now, like something heavier than a mouse being pulled slowly across the joists. A low, scraping sound that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. That wasn't a mouse. A rat, maybe? The thought made her skin crawl, but she tried to cling to it. A big, fat city rat. It was disgusting, but it was still in the realm of the explainable. She started sleeping with a low-volume podcast playing on her phone, just enough noise to cover up the sounds from above so she could get some rest. The real shift happened on a Thursday night. She told me she remembers the day specifically because she'd had a terrible day at work and all she wanted was to get into her bed and disappear. She was exhausted, bone-tired. She fell asleep almost instantly, no podcast needed. But something woke her up. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was just a feeling. The feeling of the atmosphere in the room changing. She opened her eyes to the familiar dark, the orange city glow filtering through the blinds. The silence was absolute, her ears strained, waiting for the scratching or the dragging. But there was nothing, and then she heard it. It wasn't a scratch. It wasn't a scrape. It was a whisper. It was so quiet, it was almost sub-audible, like the hiss of static from a radio that's not quite on the station. A long, drawn-out shish sound, followed by a series of soft, guttural clicks and pops. It sounded, for one terrifying, crystal-clear second, like a human voice. A hoarse, dry whisper trying to form words just on the other side of the plaster. Anne shot up in bed. She told me it was a pure, animal reflex. One second she was lying down, the next she was sitting bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was rigid, every muscle in her body locked, her ears straining so hard it felt like they were physically reaching for the sound. She held her breath, listening. But there was only silence. A deep, profound, mocking silence. The kind of silence that feels loud after a sudden noise. She stayed like that for what felt like an hour, frozen, scanning the darkness. Was it the pipes? The wind? Was she so stressed out that she was starting to have auditory hallucinations? She ran through every rational possibility, her brain clinging to them like a drowning person to a piece of driftwood. But she couldn't shake what she'd heard. The cadence, the rhythm. It wasn't a random house noise. It was the sound of speech. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat there, with the covers pulled up to her nose, watching the crack on the ceiling as if it were a venomous snake. The first sliver of gray dawn that crept into her room felt like a rescue. She only got out of bed when the sun was fully up, flooding the room with light, chasing away the shadows and the things that lurked within them. She felt hollowed out, exhausted and raw. That morning, she didn't just look at the crack. She studied it. She stood on her bed, her head tilted back, her neck aching, and traced its path with her eyes. It was definitely longer. There was no question anymore. It had branched now, a tiny new tributary splitting off near the middle, heading directly toward the spot over her pillows. The main crack now stretched a good foot, maybe more. It was a jagged, ugly scar on her once perfect ceiling. The fear was no longer a low-grade annoyance. She said it was a living thing now. It followed her around the apartment during the day. The bedroom, her sanctuary, became a place of dread. She started spending all her time in the living room, only entering the bedroom when she absolutely had to sleep. She'd get ready for bed with a sense of grim ritual, like a soldier preparing for a long night on watch. She bought a brighter nightlight and plugged it into the wall socket closest to her bed. She kept her podcast on, louder now. She was building a pathetic little fortress of light and sound around herself, trying to keep the silence at bay. She felt like she was losing her mind. She'd tell herself during the day that she was overreacting, that she was letting an old building get the better of her. She'd feel strong, rational. But the moment the sun went down and she had to face the thought of getting into that bed, the fear would come rushing back in, cold and absolute. She was living on a knife's edge of anxiety, jumpy at every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the heating. This went on for 3 more nights. 3 nights of her lying in a state of high alert, dozing off in short, nightmare-plagued bursts, only to be jolted awake by a faint scuttling or low, dragging sound from above. The whisper never came back, and she started to wonder if she really had dreamed it up, a product of sleep-deprived paranoia. Maybe it really was just rats. Big, noisy, disgusting rats. She sent another email to the management, this one more pointed, using the words, significant pest problem, and potential health hazard. The night it happened, she said she had actually managed to fool herself into a state of calm. She'd had 2 glasses of wine with dinner. It was a stupid move, she knew, but she was desperate for a solid 8 hours of sleep. The wine had done its job, blunting the sharp edges of her fear. She performed her nightly ritual, turn on the nightlight, start the podcast, check the locks 3 times, and got into bed feeling heavy and drowsy. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't lie there staring at the ceiling. She rolled over, faced the wall, and let the alcohol pull her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. She had no idea how long she was out, but when she woke, it wasn't gradual. It was instant. A switch was flipped from unconsciousness to total, heart-stopping awareness. The podcast had ended, the room was submerged in absolute quiet. And something was wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke her. It was the lack of it. The oppressive, heavy silence that had terrified her before. Her eyes snapped open in the dark. She was still on her side, facing the wall. She didn't dare move. She didn't even dare breathe. She just lay there, listening, waiting. The familiar scuttling didn't come. The scraping didn't come. There was nothing, just the low hum of the city outside and the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. And then, it came. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a scratch. It was a sigh, a long, soft, mournful exhalation of breath. It was unmistakably human, filled with a sound that was somehow both weary and patient. It was a wet, intimate sound, and it came from directly above her head, not from the center of the room, not from a corner. It was so close, she felt she could have reached up and touched the source. It was the sound of someone lying on the floorboards just on the other side of the plaster, their face pressed to the crack, sighing directly down onto her. I didn't move. I don't think I even breathed. My entire body was a single, rigid muscle, locked in place by that sound. The sigh, it hadn't been a whisper or a scratch. It was a sound of pure biology, wet and intimate, the sound of lungs emptying. And it had been right there, directly above my head. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was a heavy, listening silence. I was certain that on the other side of that thin layer of plaster and paint, something was waiting for my reaction. My blood was a roaring waterfall in my ears, so loud I was scared it would hear. I lay there, on my side, staring at the bland pattern of the wallpaper, for what felt like the entire history of the universe. Every rational explanation my brain tried to construct evaporated the instant it formed. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the wind. I knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a block of ice in my stomach, what that sound was. It was a person. The first hint of gray city dawn started to seep through the blinds, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. Only then did the paralysis begin to thaw. It wasn't a rush of courage. It was the primal need to escape the dark. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if I were trying not to startle a predator. I slid my legs out from under the duvet, my feet finding the cold wood of the floor. I didn't dare look up. My eyes were fixed on the door, my escape route. I stood up, my neck screaming in protest from being held in one position for so long. I took one step, then another. The bedroom door felt a mile away. When my hand finally closed around the cool metal of the doorknob, I felt a tremor of relief. I slipped out into the small hallway, closing the door behind me with an almost silent click. I stood there in the slightly brighter space of my living room, my back pressed against the wall, just breathing. In and out, proving to myself that I still could. I didn't go back into the bedroom for hours. I made coffee with shaking hands, spilling grounds on the counter. I sat on the sofa, wrapped in the throw blanket, and watched the full morning sun flood the apartment. The light was a bandage. It made the terror of the night feel distant, almost theatrical. But I knew it wasn't. The fear was real. It was a new piece of furniture in my apartment, and it was big and ugly, and I kept bumping into it. Around 10 o'clock, logic finally wrestled its way to the surface. I needed my clothes. I needed to brush my teeth. I couldn't spend the rest of my life huddled on the sofa. Taking a deep breath, I walked back to the bedroom door and pushed it open. Sunlight filled the space, making it look so normal. Just a room. My bed was unmade, the covers thrown back. The crack was still there on the ceiling, a thin, ugly line, but in the bright light of day it looked inert. Harmless. Maybe I had been dreaming. A vivid, terrifying nightmare brought on by stress and this old, creaky building. I clung to that thought. I walked over to the bed to pull the sheets straight, a small act of reclaiming my space. My neck was still stiff, and I stretched it, rolling my head from side to side. And that's when I saw it. At first, my brain didn't process it. It was just an anomaly. A patch on my dark gray pillowcase that was different. It was a faint, almost imperceptible dusting of white. I leaned closer. It was a fine powder, like sifted flour or chalk dust, spread in a near-perfect circle on the fabric. It was right where my head would have been. Right where my face, my open, breathing mouth, would have been resting all night. My eyes followed an invisible plumb line straight up from the pillow. Directly above it, in the center of the ceiling, was the crack. The blood drained from my face. Every flimsy rationalization I had built in the safety of daylight came crashing down. The dust. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. This was physical proof, tangible evidence. That powder had fallen from the crack. It had fallen onto my pillow while I slept, a silent, steady rain of debris. The sigh I'd heard, it wasn't just a sound from above. It was the breath of whatever was up there, dislodging the dust, sending it down onto me. The sheer violation of it hit me like a physical blow. Something had been there, not just in the attic space, not just in the ceiling, but there, at that opening, watching me. Watching me sleep, close enough to breathe on me. I stumbled back, away from the bed, a strangled noise caught in my throat. The bed, my sanctuary, the one place in the world that was supposed to be unconditionally safe, was contaminated. The room itself felt sick. The air was thick and heavy. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my laptop bag from the chair, and a random armful of clothes from my closet. I didn't even look at what I was grabbing. I just needed to get out of there. I backed out of the room, pulling the door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. That night, I didn't even consider it. The bedroom was a no-go zone, a sealed tomb. I pulled the cushions off my small sofa, found the extra duvet in the hall closet, and made a lumpy, uncomfortable bed in the living room. It was miserable. The sofa was too short, the cushions kept separating, and every groan from the building's ancient plumbing sent a jolt of panic through me. But it was better than being in that room. At least here, the ceiling was solid, unbroken. I lay awake for most of the night, staring into the darkness of a different room, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, only the deep, unsettling silence. It was almost worse. It was like it knew I had moved, like it was waiting, patiently. The next day, I called out of work. I couldn't face people. I couldn't pretend to be a normal, functioning human being. I spent the day a nervous wreck, jumping at the slightest noise. The apartment, once my cozy refuge, now felt like a cage I was sharing with something unseen. I tried to bring some order to the chaos. I did laundry, I washed the dishes, I tried to tidy up the living room, which was now cluttered with my displaced bedroom things. I went to put my hair up and my hand went to the small decorative bowl on my dresser where one always kept my favorite hair clip. It was a simple, silver barrette, but I loved it. I wore it all the time. It wasn't there. I frowned, my heart skipping a beat. I checked the bathroom counter. I sifted through the pile of clothes I'd grabbed from the bedroom. I even checked the pockets of the jeans I'd been wearing. Nothing. I told myself it was nothing. In my panic, I must have knocked it somewhere. It had probably fallen under the dresser or the bed. It was a logical explanation. But coming on top of everything else, its absence felt sinister. It was another small piece of my life that had been touched, moved, taken. Another quiet intrusion. I slept on the sofa again that night, and the night after that. My sleep was shallow and fraught with anxiety. I'd wake up a dozen times, muscles tense, heart racing. The exhaustion was becoming a physical weight. I was a ghost in my own home, tiptoeing around, confined to the living room and kitchen. My fortress had shrunk to 2 rooms. The fear was constant, a low-grade hum beneath the surface of everything, but something else was starting to bubble up alongside it, anger. It was a slow burn, but by the 3rd day of living like a refugee, I was furious. I was paying rent for this whole apartment, not just the living room. I was a grown woman, letting myself be terrorized out of my own bed by, what? Noises? A little dust? I was tired of being scared. I was tired of sleeping on a lumpy sofa and waking up with an aching back. I was tired of feeling like a guest, an intruder in my own life. That evening, I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed bedroom door. The anger felt better than the fear. It was hot and energizing. The fear had made me small and quiet, but the anger made me want to shout. This was my home. I had signed the lease. I had unpacked the boxes. I had chosen the paint color. I would not be driven out. I made a decision. It felt momentous, like a declaration of war. I was done cowering on the sofa. I was taking my room back. I walked over to the door and pushed it open. The room was dim, the late afternoon light doing little to soften its edges. I marched in, my jaw set. I stripped the sheets from the bed, the sight of that dusty pillowcase reigniting a flash of revulsion, and balled them up. I would burn them if I had to. I fetched clean linens from the closet and remade the bed with sharp, aggressive movements. My sanctuary had been violated, but I could clean it. I could reclaim it. As darkness fell, the old fear tried to creep back in. It was a cold tendril wrapping around my newfound anger. I ignored it. I did my nightly routine, but this time it was an act of defiance. I brushed my teeth in my own bathroom. I put on my pajamas in my own bedroom. I got into my own bed, the clean sheets cool against my skin. I laid on my back and stared up at the ceiling, directly at the crack. It was a thin, black line in the deepening gloom. A scar. Okay, I whispered to the empty, silent room. My voice sounded small, but firm. You've had your fun. I was still scared, of course I was. But the exhaustion and the anger were a powerful combination. I knew I couldn't solve this tonight, but I could survive it. And tomorrow, first thing in the morning, this charade was over. I was calling the building management, and I wasn't going to send a polite email. I was going to scream at them if I had to. I would tell them there was a rat the size of a cat, an infestation, a structural collapse. I didn't care what. I just wanted someone with a toolbox and a ladder to come into this room and rip that whole ceiling down if necessary. Tomorrow, it would be over. I just had to get through one more night. Sleep didn't come easy. I think that goes without saying. I lay on my back, a soldier in a trench, eyes wide open in the dark. Every creak of the old building was a footstep. Every gurgle of the pipes was a throat being cleared. My newfound anger was a good shield, but it wasn't bulletproof. Fear was still there, a cold ooze seeping through the cracks in my resolve. I kept my breathing even and slow, a performance for an audience of 1, or maybe 2. I was trying to project an aura of calm, a message to the ceiling that said, I'm not scared of you. You don't exist. After a while, maybe an hour, maybe 2, the sheer weight of exhaustion started to win. My eyelids felt like lead shutters. The anger that had fueled me all day had burned itself out, leaving behind a fine ash of bone-deep tiredness. My thoughts started to blur. The plan for tomorrow, a screaming match with the building manager, felt solid. A life raft. I just had to hold on until morning. Just get through the night. The mantra repeated itself, losing meaning with each loop, until it was just a dull hum in the back of my mind. My body yearned for oblivion, for the temporary death of sleep. And finally, against my better judgment, I let it have it. I drifted off, my hand still resting on the nightstand, only a few inches from my phone. It was the sound that woke me. Not a creak, not a groan, not a sigh. This one was different. It was sharp, definitive. A single, loud clack. It was the sound of something solid hitting a wood floor, or maybe a piece of plaster finally giving way and falling onto the attic boards above. It was so sudden and loud that it bypassed my brain and went straight to my nerves. I jolted awake, my heart launching itself against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was sitting bolt upright before I was even fully conscious. The room was pitch black. Silent. The silence after a loud noise is always the worst part. It's a listening silence, pregnant with possibility. I sat there, straining my ears, waiting for a follow-up sound. A scurry, a scratch, anything, nothing, and that's when the anger, which had been sleeping, woke up too. It came back hot and fast. I was done. Completely, utterly, 100% done. I had been chased out of my own bed for 3 nights. I had been living on edge, jumping at shadows, my entire life compressed into my living room. All for this. For these sounds, for this stupid crack, for this constant, low-grade psychological warfare. Whoever, whatever it was, it had had its fun. Now I was just pissed off. What now? I muttered into the darkness, my voice a low growl. I was past the point of being quiet. Let it hear me, let it know I was awake and I was angry. I wasn't even thinking about what might be up there anymore. My mind was stubbornly, almost childishly, fixed on a rational explanation. A large rat had probably dislodged a piece of wood. A loosened bit of the ceiling had finally fallen. Fine. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just call the building manager, I'd call an exterminator and a structural engineer. I'd have this whole damn ceiling torn out and replaced if I had to. Fueled by this wave of irritation, I reached over and fumbled for the switch on my bedside lamp. I wasn't trying to be stealthy. I was annoyed, and I wanted to see if a fresh pile of that white dust was on my floor. I wanted evidence. I wanted something tangible to shove in the manager's face in the morning. The lamp clicked on. The light was weak, a soft yellow glow that pushed the deepest shadows back but didn't quite erase them. It painted the room in muted, sleepy colors. I squinted, my eyes adjusting. Then, with a sigh of pure exasperation, I leaned my head back against the headboard and looked up at the ceiling. Right at the crack. My brain didn't process it at first. It's funny how that works. The mind has this incredible defense mechanism where it will refuse to see what it can't comprehend. For a split second, I just saw the crack. That familiar, ugly black line. And then, I saw the anomaly. A change in the texture. A break in the pattern of the thin, dark line. It was a perfect circle, interrupting the jagged scar of the crack. A circle of something wet and reflective, with a smaller, blacker circle in its center. And then the defense mechanism failed. The dam broke. My mind didn't just see it, it understood it. It registered the faint blue of the iris. It registered the tiny, branching red veins in the surrounding white. It registered the pinprick of reflected light from my own lamp. It registered that the small, black circle in the middle was a dilated pupil. I was looking at an eye. A human eye, staring directly down at me from the crack in my ceiling. Time stopped. Air ceased to exist. My body, which moments before had been buzzing with angry energy, turned instantly to stone. I didn't scream. I didn't even gasp. The sound was trapped somewhere in my throat, a solid ball of ice. My lungs forgot how to work. The only thing I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears, the sound of my own circulatory system shutting down in sheer, abject terror. It wasn't a monster's eye. It wasn't red or glowing or demonic. It was worse. It was a normal eye. A perfectly, horribly, casually normal human eye. And it was looking at me. And it did not blink. We just stayed like that, locked in this impossible, silent tableau. Me, frozen in my bed, bathed in the weak lamplight. It, a single, unblinking eye, a disembodied observer slotted into the ceiling like a key in a lock. My entire reality collapsed in on itself. Every rationalization, every moment of self-doubt, every attempt to explain away the strangeness was incinerated in the face of this undeniable proof. The sigh I'd heard, it wasn't the building, it was him, his lungs, his breath. The dust on my pillow. It wasn't just falling debris. It was him, shifting, breathing, watching me sleep, so close that the plaster he displaced rained down on my face. The scratching sounds, his fingers, his nails, maybe widening the crack just enough. My missing hair clip, the thought hit me like a physical blow. Where was it? Was it up there with him? A trophy? A little piece of me, kept in his nest just a few feet above my head. The sheer violation of it was a tidal wave. It washed over me, drowning the fear in something colder and deeper. This wasn't a haunting, this was an infestation. A predator had made its den directly above my sanctuary, my bed, and had been watching me. For how long? Since I moved in? Had he been there every single night, lying in the dark, his eye pressed to that crack, waiting? My mind, in its panic, tried to fight back. It's a reflection. It's a knot in the attic wood. It's a water stain. But the eye was too real. It was two-dimensional. In the faint light, I could see the minute, involuntary tremors of the eyelid. The subtle wetness of the cornea. It was alive, and it was watching me. How long did we stay like that? I have no idea. Time had become a thick, gelatinous substance. It could have been 5 seconds. It could have been 5 minutes. My entire world had shrunk to the space between my terrified eyes and his, a single, unblinking one. I felt like a specimen pinned to a board. I was prey. I finally, truly understood what it felt like to be prey. Not just hunted, but observed, studied, savored by the hunter before the final pounce. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I was convinced that the slightest twitch, the slightest intake of air, would be the signal. The signal for what? I didn't know. For the plaster to break? For a hand to come reaching through? The not knowing was a separate kind of torture. And then, something changed. It was so small, so subtle, that I almost didn't believe it was happening. The eye, which had been wide and unblinking, suddenly contracted. The eyelid tightened, just a fraction. It was the motion someone makes when they're focusing, when they're zeroing in on something. It squinted. He knew that I could see him. The staring contest was over. The veil of ignorance was gone. This was no longer just him watching me. This was us, watching each other. The secret was out, and as that realization crashed down on me, a new sound came from the ceiling. It wasn't a word, it wasn't a threat, it was worse. It was a low, guttural noise, a vibration that I felt in my teeth as much as I heard with my ears. It was a sound caught somewhere between a hum and a breath. A wet, stifled, private sound. It was the sound of amusement. A quiet, repressed chuckle. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying my terror. The game wasn't that he was watching me. The game was waiting for me to realize I was being watched. The sound shattered my paralysis. It was the starting gun I had been dreading. The cold terror instantly flashed into white-hot, mindless panic. The thought of calling the manager, of reclaiming my room, of being angry, it was all so laughable now. I was a fool, a proud, stupid fool who had defiantly marched back into the lion's cage and curled up to go to sleep. He knew I saw him. And he was laughing. That quiet, breathy chuckle from the ceiling was the single most obscene sound I had ever heard. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a maniacal laugh. It was a private sound. The kind of sound someone makes to themselves when they see something they find deeply, personally amusing. And I was the punchline. My terror was his little secret joke. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't bravery. It was an overload. The fear had been a cold, paralyzing liquid, but that sound, that chuckle, was like dropping a lit match into gasoline. A new feeling erupted, white-hot and blinding, rage. A pure, animal rage that burned away the paralysis. How dare he? How dare this thing, this person, turn my fear into his entertainment? How dare he laugh at me from his filthy nest above my head, a space he had invaded, a sanctuary he had defiled? But before I could even form a thought, before the rage could translate into a scream or a movement, the chuckle was cut short. It was replaced by a new sound. A low groan. It wasn't him. This was the building itself. A deep, guttural noise, like an old man trying to shift in his sleep. It was the sound of immense weight settling where it shouldn't be. I felt it as much as I heard it, low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel up the legs of the bed, through the mattress, and into my bones. The single eye was gone. The crack it had peered through was no longer a neat, dark line. It was visibly widening. A spider web of smaller fissures shot out from the main crack, branching across the white plaster like black lightning. A fine, white powder, heavier than before, began to drift down, a silent, sickening snowfall that coated my duvet. He was moving, he was putting his weight on it. My mind, which had been a screaming chaos of rage and fear, suddenly went very, very quiet. The two emotions canceled each other out, leaving behind a cold, sharp-edged clarity. The kind of clarity you get right before a car crash. I wasn't thinking about who he was or why he was there anymore. I wasn't thinking about my missing hair clip or the dust on my pillow. All of that was history. The only thing that existed was the physics of the situation. A man was on a thin layer of plaster and drywall above my bed, and he was trying to come through. The groan intensified, punctuated by a sharp crack like a frozen tree branch snapping in two. A chunk of plaster the size of my fist detached and plummeted, hitting my pillow with a soft, heavy thud. Exactly where my head had been just minutes before. That was it. That was the starting gun. I moved. It wasn't a decision. It was an instinct, a command from a part of my brain older than thought. My legs swung over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wood floor with a slap that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. I didn't get up in a fluid motion. I scrambled, a clumsy, desperate crab walk away from the bed, my eyes still glued to the ceiling. The rain of dust was getting thicker now, mixed with larger grits of plaster. The groaning was continuous, a chorus of stressed wood and tortured drywall. It was the sound of a ship breaking apart. My survival instinct had a two-item checklist. Phone, keys. My bedside lamp was still on, casting its weak yellow light on the scene. My phone was right there, next to it. My hand shot out, fingers fumbling, my nails scraping against the wood of the nightstand before finding the smooth glass. I snatched it up. My other hand, acting of its own accord, swept across the top of my dresser, searching for the telltale jingle of my keys. My fingers closed around the cold metal. Phone in one hand, keys in the other. I had my tools for escape. I didn't dare look back at the bed. I didn't want to see the hole. I didn't want to see what might be emerging from it. I just ran. My bedroom door was only 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I was a clumsy animal, tripping over the corner of a rug, my shoulder slamming into the doorframe. The keys in my hand rattled, a frantic, tinny sound against the deep bass groan of the ceiling. I wrenched the bedroom door open and stumbled out into the small hallway of my apartment. I didn't stop. The front door was my only goal. The world had shrunk to that single rectangle of wood, and then I heard it from behind me. It wasn't a groan or a crack anymore. It was a final, catastrophic shearing sound. A loud, wet RRRRIP like a giant tearing a phone book in half, followed by a deafening whump. The sound hit my back like a physical force, a concussion of air pressure that made me stagger. A cloud of thick, choking white dust billowed out of my bedroom behind me. The ceiling had given way. He was down. He was in my room. A new wave of terror, colder and sharper than anything before, propelled me forward. I wasn't running from a sound anymore. I was running from a person. A person who was now standing in my bedroom, just feet away. I reached the front door, my breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely see the keys. The correct key, the one for the deadbolt, was lost in the jangling swarm of metal. I jabbed one key at the lock. It didn't fit. Another. Wrong one. My mind was screaming, "Hurry! He's in the bedroom. He heard the door. He knows you're here. He's coming." Behind me, in the sudden, ringing silence that followed the collapse, I heard a new sound. A soft thud, the sound of feet landing on a wood floor. He had landed on his feet. He wasn't hurt. My fingers finally found the familiar shape of the deadbolt key. With a sob of relief, I jammed it into the lock. It grated as I twisted, the sound of my salvation. I ripped the door open and threw myself out into the dimly lit, blessedly empty public hallway of the apartment building. I didn't run, not yet. I slammed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing down the corridor. My hands, still shaking, fumbled to lock it from the outside. I had to lock him in. I had to trap him. It was a stupid, irrational thought. He had just come through a ceiling. A door wouldn't stop him for long, but I needed that barrier. I needed that small, symbolic victory. I turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying, final thunk. Done. Safe. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, my entire body trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. I squeezed my eyes shut, gasping for air that didn't taste of plaster dust. For a single, beautiful second, I allowed myself to feel a sliver of relief. I was out. He was in. There was a locked door between us. I had just started to straighten up, ready to turn and run for the stairs, my phone clutched in my hand to call 911, when I heard it. A sound from the other side of the door, right in front of my face. It was a faint, metallic scrape. I froze, my ear just inches from the wood, and then I heard it clearly. The unmistakable sound of a hand closing around the doorknob on the inside. Jiggle, jiggle, the brass knob began to turn, slowly at first, then more forcefully. He was trying the door. He was trying to get out. He was coming after me. For a second that stretched into an eternity, my brain just shut down. The sound of the knob turning was the most impossible, horrifying sound in the world. It was a clear, mechanical fact that completely contradicted the single, flimsy layer of safety I had just created for myself. A lock is supposed to keep people out. It's not supposed to be the thing that tells you they're right on the other side, patiently trying to join you. He was coming after me. That single thought was a lightning strike to my system. The paralysis broke. I didn't scream. I didn't even make a sound. I just turned and ran. My bare feet pounded against the cheap, industrial carpet of the hallway, a flat, ugly sound in the dead quiet of the building. I flew past the other doors on my floor, silent, dark rectangles that offered no help. They were just scenery in my own personal horror movie. The stairwell door was heavy and metal. I slammed into it with my shoulder, the impact jarring my teeth, and shoved it open. The smell of cold concrete and stale air hit me. I didn't take the stairs one at a time. I half fell, half jumped down the flights, my hands sliding down the cool, gritty metal railing, my phone and keys still clutched in a death grip. Every echo in the stairwell sounded like footsteps behind me. Every clang of my feet on the metal-edged steps was, in my head, the sound of the apartment door splintering open. I didn't stop until I burst through the final door and stumbled into the lobby. The lobby, it was like entering another world. The lights were a harsh, buzzing fluorescent white. A sad-looking fake plant sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. The air was still. It was achingly, blessedly normal. I staggered to the far wall, away from the elevators and the stairwell door, and slid down to the cold linoleum floor. My body was finally catching up with my mind. A violent tremble started in my hands and spread through my entire frame. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, a loud, frantic clicking in the silence. I looked at the phone in my hand. The screen was still lit up. My thumb, clumsy and slick with sweat, fumbled across the screen. I almost dropped it, twice. Finally, the three numbers. 911. I pressed call. The voice that answered was calm, female, and professional. 911, what's your emergency? My own voice came out as a broken, airy croak. I had to clear my throat, swallowing against a lump of pure terror. There's someone in my apartment. Okay, ma'am, where are you located? I gave her the address, my voice shaking so badly I had to repeat the street name. Apartment 4B, the top floor, but I'm not in there. I'm in the lobby. I ran out. Is the person still in the apartment? Yes, I locked him in. He came through the ceiling of my bedroom. I knew how insane it sounded. I could hear it in my own voice. A crazy person story. For a second, I was afraid she wouldn't believe me, that she'd think it was a prank call. But her voice didn't change. It stayed a firm, even keel. He came through the ceiling? Is he armed? Did you see a weapon? I don't know. I didn't. I just saw an eye. And then the ceiling collapsed. I ran. My breath was coming in ragged, painful hitches. He was trying the front door after me. He was trying to get out. Okay, ma'am, I have officers on their way. They are very close. Is your name in? The question caught me off guard. Yes. How did you? It's on the call display. And I need you to stay on the line with me. Stay where you are in the lobby. Can you see the front entrance of the building? Yes, I could. The glass doors showed the empty, quiet street outside, washed in the orange glow of the streetlights. It looked peaceful. It looked like nothing was wrong. Good. I want you to tell me the second you see the patrol car. They're coming with sirens off so they don't alert him. Just stay on the line. And so I did. I sat there on the cold floor, hugging my knees to my chest, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Every tiny sound from upstairs, a distant door closing, the groan of the elevator cables, made me flinch. I felt exposed, even down here. Was he looking for a way out? A fire escape? A window? My apartment faced the back alley. He could be gone by now. Or he could be waiting. He could be listening. I kept my eyes glued to the front doors, praying for the sight of flashing lights. It felt like I waited for a year. In reality, it was probably less than 3 minutes. A dark car with no markings slid silently to the curb, and then another one right behind it. 2 officers got out of the first car, and 2 from the second. They moved fast, with a purpose that made my heart leap with a desperate, painful kind of gratitude. They weren't sauntering. They believed me. "They're here," I whispered into the phone, my voice cracking with relief. "Okay, and they see you through the glass. Let them in," the dispatcher said. I scrambled up, my legs feeling like jelly, and hurried to the door, fumbling to unlock the main entrance. The first officer through the door was a big guy, built like a refrigerator, with a calm, serious face. He held a hand up. "Stay right here, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't talking to me as much as he was commanding the situation. He and another officer stayed by the elevators while the other 2, younger and carrying heavy-looking rifles, headed for the stairs. The next few minutes were a blur of muffled sounds from above. I heard their heavy boots on the stairs. I heard a sharp, authoritative voice yell, "Police! Open the door!" A pause, more shouting, and then a sound that made me jump, a deafening boom that echoed all the way down to the lobby. They had breached the door. There was more shouting, sounds of a scuffle, a heavy thud. And then, silence. A deep, profound silence that felt more final than all the noise before it. I stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, arms wrapped around myself, barely breathing. The big officer who had stayed behind watched me, his expression unreadable. Finally, his radio crackled to life. A voice, clear and slightly out of breath, came through. "Suspect in custody. Unit is clear." The officer gave a slight nod, then looked at me. "It's over, ma'am. He's in custody." The words didn't register at first. And then they did. A wave of relief so powerful it buckled my knees washed over me. I started crying, not loudly, just silent, hot tears that poured down my face, a physical release of all the terror I'd been holding inside. The big officer just waited patiently, giving me a moment. Another officer, one of the younger ones who had gone up, came down the stairs. "We'll need you to come up and give a statement, ma'am." "When you're ready," I nodded, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "Okay, I'm ready." Walking back up those stairs was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The hallway was brightly lit now, propped open with a doorstop. My front door, or what was left of it, hung crookedly off one hinge, the lock and part of the frame completely splintered. And inside, it was a disaster zone. A thick layer of white plaster dust coated everything, making the whole place look like it was covered in a layer of diseased snow. And in the center of my bedroom, a gaping, jagged hole in the ceiling. My bed was buried under a pile of drywall, splintered wood, and insulation. That was where I would have been. They had him sitting on my living room couch. He was surprisingly small, a thin, wiry man in his 40s, maybe, with greasy, thinning hair and a pale, sweaty face. He was wearing dirty jeans and a dark gray sweatshirt. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor, his hands cuffed behind his back. He didn't look like a monster. He looked pathetic. That was almost worse. There was no grand evil, just this sad, grimy little man who had lived above my head like a rat. I gave my statement to the older, calmer officer, a man named Sergeant Miller. I told him everything, my voice still shaky but getting stronger. The crack, the noises, the dust, the eye, the collapse, the whole insane story. He wrote it all down in a small notebook, nodding, his expression patient and professional. When I was done, a wave of exhaustion hit me. It was over. The physical threat was gone. He was caught. I was safe. A shaky, fragile sense of relief began to settle in my bones. "We searched the crawlspace he was living in," Sergeant Miller said, his voice gentle. "Found his little nest up there. Food wrappers, water bottles. Looks like he was there for a while. We also found a few things we believe belong to you." Another officer brought over a large, clear evidence bag. Inside was a small, grimy cardboard box. Miller, wearing blue latex gloves, carefully opened the bag and tipped the contents of the box onto my dusty coffee table. My breath caught in my throat. There was my favorite hair clip, the one with the little mother-of-pearl inlay I thought I'd lost at the gym months ago. There was the tube of cherry chapstick I was sure had fallen out of my purse. There were my small, silver hoop earrings. a gift from my sister I'd assumed I'd misplaced while cleaning. They were all there, my missing things, my little trophies. He hadn't just been up there, he had been in here. He had walked through my apartment, through my life, picking up little pieces of me to take back to his nest. The shaky relief I had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, crawling nausea. I thought I lost these, I whispered. Looks like he'd been coming in when you were at work, Miller said, his voice grim. We're still trying to figure out how he got a key. But that wasn't the worst part. The other young officer came over, holding another evidence bag. This one held a single, flimsy piece of paper. It was one of those cheap, fold-out calendars you get for free from a real estate agent or a local bank. He laid it on the table. We found this, too, tucked into his sleeping bag. It was folded to the current month. And there, on today's date, was a circle drawn in thick, red ink. A messy, uneven circle. Next to the circle, scrawled in the same red ink, were 2 words. The handwriting was childish, but deliberate. The letters were perfectly clear. Meet up. I stared at the words. Meet up. My blood ran cold. The air left my lungs. The entire narrative in my head violently shattered and reassembled itself into something infinitely more horrifying. I hadn't just discovered him by chance. The collapse of the ceiling, my escape, that wasn't me being clever. That was me ruining the plan. I wasn't a random occupant of a convenient apartment. I was the target. Today was the day. Today was the day he had decided he was done watching from the cracks in the ceiling. Today was the day he was going to come down. The chuckle I'd heard, it wasn't just amusement at my fear. It was anticipation. He hadn't been trying to escape. He hadn't been coming after me in the hallway. He was just trying the door, confused, wondering why his target was suddenly on the wrong side of a locked door, off script. My apartment wasn't a sanctuary he had defiled. It was a trap he had set. It was a stage, and all this time, I hadn't been living in my home. I'd been living in his calendar, waiting for my name to be called. And tonight, I'd been seconds away from my scheduled appointment.